for the fifth row, please? Thank you. Yeah, yeah, we're like 3, 4, 5 up.
Okay, so we're months.
Also, if you like know anybody else that's a part of this conference, like text them, please. Say hi. What's up?
Are you guys close?
Yeah.
Is it a raffle or is it
I don't know how he's gonna do it. He brought along.
all right, all right. If your car's not playing, I'll go with that game. You know what? Playing the game, bro. How did definition work? How does he want control? That kind of sucks.
I'll get you the mic. Yeah.
That's what
If
our
you give me
purpose is.
his mic too, I'll light him up.
Really good. I got the spicy scallion cream cheese. Okay, those are okay. Marston, easy. You know, she's a centrist. Yeah, Marston is easy. I studied for the MCAT in Marston. It was beautiful. Marston,
I'm trying to figure out how long it could possibly take for security. If there's only 2 rooms, there's no way it takes a long time. Yeah, okay. Because I really don't want to leave to like after everything. I think boarding's at 7:20. Flight is at like 8. So currently my Uber is over for 6:30.
He's fired.
Or like 6:45. Like I would do like 6:45, drop off at 7, and then 20 minutes away to go through security.
What major are you? We're up against dudes, and then we were there, and I saw like the notification from Houston. That's gonna be easy money for you.
questions too about like, we'll go through the entire day. So we're gonna start with this talk with Brody Mullins. We'll take a short break and then go into Dr. Altman's talk. And then right afterwards, we're gonna we're gonna have lunch, and we catered salads, which is like New Haven local pizza, which I think is my favorite pizza in New Haven. And afterwards, we're gonna walk everybody up to KWG where we have all of your posters set up already, and then we've invited our graduate judges to come judge as well. I'm sure that a lot of you, actually, the people who are in Vanderbilt, on your walk over probably saw like everything that's going on. McKinnis is being inaugurated, very big stuff. I'm sure very notable alumni on campus. So we'll make that walk together. We'll take a look at like what's happening, the parades, and then you'll give your presentations. It'll go on for about 4 hours. We'll do like a switch in between. We'll split half of you up so that half of you can go around and walk to other projects and talk to other people about their research. And then we'll do a switch so that you're in front of your posters. You don't have to stand for 4 hours straight. Right after that, at about 5 to 5:30, we'll walk together to the New Haven Lawn Club where we have dinner that will be served. It'll be a cash bar, and so I think it'll be a nice event. Yeah, you'll give all of your dining preferences there, and they'll get us settled. I know that some of you have flights going out at 8. Is that the earliest flight that there is? Is anybody leaving any time earlier? Cool. So we'll have you out by about 7:30. If you're flying out from Tweed, it's like a really small airport. So if you leave at like 7:10, I'm sure you're gonna get on that plane just fine. They'll actually probably they'll force you to walk out on the tarmac yourself. Yeah, it's wonderful. How was last night? Everything goes smoothly. Good. I think it was quite fun with our 3 speakers in that panel. I think I had a lot of fun moderating that as well. So whenever Rishi gets here, appeared. He's not ready. But to moderate this talk, I think Brody Mullins, really cool guy. I'm really excited to have him here during this conference. Wrote the Wolves of KStreet. He'll decide like how he's doing this book giveaway, but very exciting stuff. He's going to talk a little bit about lobbying in the United States and what that means and what he's discovered through his research, and also being a journalist, an investigative reporter, which is like a perspective that we haven't had before. I think yesterday's talks too were mainly focused on bio. All right, here he comes now. So let's give a warm welcome to. And Rishi will give us an introduction afterwards.
Good morning, everyone. So we have Rishi moderating and Mr. Mullins as our guest speakers. So just a quick introduction to Mr. Mullins. I'm really thrilled that he was able to come up here from Washington, D.C. to the wonderful weather in New Haven. Mr. Mullins is an investigative journalist for the Wall Street Journal. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Wolves of KStreet, which is a book about the intersection between lobbying, big money, and politics. And he is currently on the advisory board for the Center for Effective Lawmaking between the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University. Since 1997, Mr. Mullins has uncovered political scandals and investigated the financial dealings that shape our nation's capital. His work provides a critical lens on how billionaires, lobbyists, and political insiders influence governments at the expense of everyday Americans. For 28 years, Mr. Mullins has been combining the fields of economics and political journalism to address monetary influence in politics. And I'll pass over the stage to him and Rishi because.
Great. So again, thank you, Mr. Mullins, for coming out here. We're very excited, and I think we're going to jump right into it. Great. So I think that really one of the main focuses of our conference is to discuss and sort of illustrate all of the different ways that research manifests. And I think that when people see investigative journalism and they think of undergraduate research, they don't exactly think of those two things in the same room. But in your work as an investigative journalist, what are the sort of different approaches that you use in this research? And how are they sort of mixed together when you're looking to build a compelling story?
Yeah. So, well, thanks for having me, first of all, appreciate it. So when I was thinking about this the other day, journalism and the research we do in journalism and the research that's done in the academic world or in the scientific world or the medical community at first seems completely different. But then I realized that a lot of the research that I do as an investigative reporter is similar to scientific research. I sort of start off with a hypothesis. What do I think a good story is, or what is the story I think is true, and then you go out and get data to prove or disprove it or make it better. And sometimes I say, if I have a story about, if I'm working on a particular story, and I go out and do research and I find out the opposite is true, that can be just as interesting to me because you just want to go wherever the facts go. You want to find out that your hypothesis is not true. Oftentimes when your hypothesis is not true, it's more interesting because you've come up with a hypothesis before you've done the research. In journalism, unlike your worlds, there's two different types of research. There's data, and then what I call human reporting or human research, which is interviews, which is talking to people. The information you get from talking to people can be flawed based on someone's political beliefs or their political affiliation or where they're born or where they're from or how they were raised or what school they went to. So as a reporter, you need to talk to as many people as possible to sort of correct for that bias. But also talking to human sources is how you get story ideas, which you can then go try to find data and prove or disprove. On the data side, I think there's a misconception that in Washington or in politics, information comes from this smoke-filled room and these like backroom deals that are taking place outside of the view of the public. I have found in my lifetime in DC the opposite to be true. I think before Watergate, before the Nixon era, that hypothesis was true. Information was hidden. People didn't know how government functioned. There was not C-SPAN in congressional committee hearings. Now there's so much data, there's so much disclosure that my issue is like, how do you synthesize that data? Because there's too much information out there. For example, I'm older than you guys, but when I would cover, the Joe Biden's campaign, for example, and his quarterly fundraising report come out, the way I would see it is I would print out the report. And you print out that report, it's about this tall. That's too much information. You can't tell what's going on. Today, there's so much information that what you need is people who can synthesize it for it, who can pull it together in order to see patterns. So anyway, those are the two types of researching data that I use.
So going back to that, you discussed that there's that human side and there's that data side. In our conversations before, you described these personal narratives as they sort of lay on top of the facts when you're building that story. So how do you maintain that sort of balance? And when you have a sort of a biased sample size of a human being, what is that relevance? How much is a good sample size to do that, or are you looking for specific stories there?
Because journalism is not a science, I don't have a scientific answer to that. Right? It's sort of like a gut feeling when you think you have it. And look, there's problems in the media because reporters are human and humans make mistakes, and you can't interview 10,000 people. You need to trust your gut, and sometimes your gut is wrong, or sometimes reporters aren't experienced enough, or sometimes reporters get taken advantage of because they're only talking to one side and not the other. So there's definitely flaws, which I think has led to so much distrust of the media across the political span, but particularly on the right. And the right thinks that the media is biased to the left. I think for the most part they're onto something, which is a different topic. But I think the idea is that you, as a reporter, you talk to people to get ideas, to get thoughts, to get story ideas, and then you go find the data to support or disprove that hypothesis. And then we're talking about layering human reporting on top. What I meant is the best stories are stories about people. They're not 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's let's tell a story that explains a problem or an issue. So let's just pick tariffs from last week. So tariffs will lead to higher prices, which will lead to problems, which will lead to stores shutting down, which will lead to families going bankrupt. Instead of just finding the data that will exist on that from the Labor Department or from the Commerce Department, let's go find a family or a town maybe that really illustrates, it brings that to life, because stories about people or towns or humanity are much more interesting to humans. So you want to sort of find a story that's true and then find a family or a person who can sort of help tell that story.
I just want to check if my mic is.
I don't know if it is.
Yeah, we want to switch on the.
This one?
Yep, right inside.
Oh, that was off the whole time.
There we go. All right.
Should I start over?
So yeah, I mean, going back, so is, what your expertise is. You have the author of this amazing new book, The Wolves of KStreet. For those of us kind of unfamiliar, completely new to the lobbying world, how do these actions, how pervasive are they, and really how much effect do they have on our daily lives?
So our book is really about how, so I covered lobbying in Washington for 20 years at the Wall Street Journal and 5-ish years before that, other publications. I grew up in Washington, and we all read the history books, and we read about Standard Oil and AT&T, these big monopolies, the railroad barons, and J.P. Morgan back in the 1890s and 1900s. And then I looked at Washington in the last 20 years as I've covered companies and industries and seen how much power companies have now in Washington. And I sort of assumed that in the last 100 years, companies have always had tons of power. And what I found out, I guess I should probably already know this, is that from after that era, after the industrial age and after the era where Standard Oil and Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan had all this industrial and political power in Washington, the American people rebelled from that. We had, after these big trusts, we had created the antitrust laws. We created the Federal Trade Commission. We passed laws to rein in the power of big companies and industries and to break them up. And from the New Deal to the Great Society, the government grew and grew and grew, and companies actually did not have much influence during that time. From maybe 1900s or so until 1970, companies had very little influence in D.C. They didn't really have a lot of money. They didn't make a lot of campaign donations. They didn't have lobbyists. They didn't have offices in D.C. Companies sort of thought their job was to run their businesses, and the government's job was to make rules and regulations. So that companies didn't push back very hard on the growth of a lot of the federal government. In fact, supported lots of the growth. And this is Republicans and Democrats who are growing the government during that period. People forget that the Environmental Protection Agency was created by Richard Nixon. Like, you never think that a Republican would create a big regulatory clean air agency, but they did, because at that time, sort of everyone thought this was the right, the government, these are roles the government should be playing. In the 1970s, things changed when the economy creator, Jimmy Carter, was president, and companies for the first time started investing in Washington, trying to push back on these regulations. So we sort of write about how political power, how corporate power has ebbed and flowed. And for a lot of that, we use a lot of our reporting is stories, but also there is in the lobbying world data that we could go to, and the data is contained in the lobbying disclosure or required by the Lobbying Disclosure Act. So the only rule we have in lobbying is completely legal. It's permitted. The right to petition your government is protected in the First Amendment, just like the right to any speech. You, me, any individual, a business owner, a lobbyist has the right to go talk to members of Congress to change legislation. That is what lobbying is. Very few rules because of the First Amendment. An exception is the Lobbying Disclosure Act says that if you are a lobbyist, you have to disclose your lobbying activities. Once a quarter, you fill out basically a one-page form that says, here's my name, here's what I'm lobbying on behalf of, here's what I'm lobbying for, and here's how much money I'm making. And the question then is, well, who needs to file this form? And the law says if you're a lobbyist. So then the question is, who is a lobbyist? The definition of a lobbyist is if you spend 20% or more of your time actually talking to a member of Congress. So if you pick up the phone or email or text after class, your member of Congress, you're not a lobbyist. But if you're working for a company and you're spending more than 20% of your time, you are a lobbyist if you fill out this form. So we sort of looked at those lobbying disclosure forms to show a huge increase in the amount of lobbying from the 1970s. Now, more companies, more lobbyists, more money. But then we found something really interesting also, which was a sort of a flaw in this data, which is that in 2007, this was too young for Jack Abramoff. Does anyone remember the name Jack Abramoff? Jack Abramoff was a corrupt lobbyist in the 2000s who used sports tickets, and he would give to members of Congress sports tickets and golf outings and trips and cash and steak dinners, all to sort of bribe members of Congress. He was caught, went to jail. Congress passed a law in 2007 to clean up the lobbying industry as much as they could. And that law said that lobbyists can no longer buy steak dinners for members of Congress and can't bring them to sports games and can't, like, all sorts of rules and regulations to separate the ties between lobbyists and lawmakers. And that was one reason that lobbyists got sort of a bad name want to spend a little less time talking to members of Congress. Therefore, I won't have to be a lobbyist. Therefore, I can keep doing all those things that other people that are normally not allowed to do. So what we see is the amount of lobbying from the 1970s to 2007 goes straight up. And in 2007, there were 14,000 registered lobbyists in DC. And today there's 13,000. So there's no way there's less lobbying going on in DC now than there was 15 years ago. But according to data, there is. So even in this area where we have this good data, there's flaws because people can change, can play games with whether they're going to consider themselves a lobbyist or not.
There's that interbalancing of the human perspective and sort of a broader image with the data that you're getting.
Yeah.
So I wanted
one thing just to keep on this data for a second. So the main character in our book, so our book tells the story of the rise of corporate influence in DC and how lobbying has changed. And going back to the first question, we try to tell the story through characters, through people. We don't want to write a long, boring history of lobbying. We want to write stories about really colorful people. So one of the main guys we write about is a lobbyist named Everett Morris, who worked for a company called Genentech. Genentech's a big biotech company out in San Francisco. Spoiler alert, Evan Morris got caught in a lobbying corruption scandal and ended up killing himself. And we start the book with his downfall. But because I did so much reporting on him, I was able to get non-public information about his lobbying. So someone gave me his Genentech's lobbying budget. So every year, his boss in San Francisco gave $50 million to Evan Morris to lobby on behalf of Genentech. So I took that $50 million and I went to the lobbying disclosure database and said, okay, well, how much of that is being disclosed? $5 million was disclosed. So if you look at the public data, Genentech spends $5 million, but in reality, it's $50 million. So that sort of shows. So I can't do that for every company, but it shows if that scale is the same, then it means the public database that we have, the only rule for lobbying disclosure is off by 10 times, which is sort of basic.
I wanted to talk about going back to the story that won you the Pulitzer Prize. I remember that when we were having this discussion, I was surprised that you called this story remarkably easy once you found it. And again, going back to the topic of just sheer vast amounts of data and the concept of building the story, can you give us a little bit more insight on what prompted you to investigate this angle and sort through all of this information?
Yeah, I feel like this is a perfect story for this conversation. So I think that you'll agree, once you get the data, analyzing it's not hard. The problem is finding, is there a data? Can you find the data? Once you pull it all together, you can figure out, now with AI, right, like I can just do it for you. So let's start at the beginning. In 2010 or so, I'm a reporter in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is a business newspaper. We like numbers, we like business, we like stocks, we like Wall Street. So, we write stories on those topics. So I wrote a lot about this stock ownership of members of Congress. So if you're a member of Congress, like any American, you're allowed to invest in the stock market. Even in Congress, there are no rules prohibiting members of Congress from buying stock in a company that they're regulating. So you can own stock in Google and then vote against, the Google regulation bill, or vice versa. You can own stock in Google and author legislation that helps tech on whatever issue. Completely allowed to do that as long as the member of Congress discloses, which they do every year, their financial portfolio. So these financial portfolios for members of Congress are incredibly easy to find. You can Google your member of Congress and Lobbying Disclosure Act, Financial Disclosure Form, and in 10 seconds have their whole financial portfolio. So I spent a few years writing stories about that, what members of Congress owned and how they acted. And after those stories, I said to my editor, hey, we should really do the same thing, but look at not just members of Congress, but members of the executive branch. So, Congress is the legislative branch, they make the laws. The executive branch is filled with tens of thousands, all the people that Trump and Musk are firing right now, hundreds of thousands of people work for the executive branch. This is, let's go back to the EPA. The EPA has an administrator, there's a couple important people at the top. The EPA might have 30,000 people who work for the EPA implementing all these crazy regulations. They're the experts that make these agencies work. And there's 150 agencies. So I said, man, every government employee, just like every member of Congress, has to fill out one of these financial 10 years, we're like, that'd be a great story. But it's just so much work. Like getting that kind of data was intimidating. Yeah, I knew it was a good story. Anyway, cut to, let's say 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I'm not sure when we did it. My editor said, okay, let's like do this. So we knew that in theory, every agency has a requirement that their employees fill out these forms, and those forms are housed somewhere. They're not on the internet. They're required to be made public. So we took a list of, I think, 70 or 80 agencies. And the idea was, let's go ask these agencies to get these trading forms, going back 5 years. And we started calling them, and some said, sure, here they are, and some agencies made it very difficult. They said, sure, all you do is fill out this form, let us know the names of the forms you want, names of the people, and we'll give them to you. And we were like, well, we don't know, we don't know who works for the EPA, and you tell us the names. They're like, oh, we couldn't tell you who works for us. So some people made it this big game, so we had to file for some agencies, Freedom of Information Act requests to get, like, hey, EPA, can you tell us the names of your employees? And then 6 months later, they like reluctantly would give us the names. Once we had the names, then we go back and ask for their filing forms. Anyway, we did this through 70 agencies. We got to a huge database of tens of thousands of federal employees and their forms. And then we said, okay, now we have this data. What do we do with it? And we said, well, if you work for a different agency, the rules are different depending on which agency you work for. If you own Exxon stock and you work for the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that's probably fine. But if you own Exxon stock and you work for the EPA, well, that might be a problem. So we sort of took each agency and said, hey, what do we not want to see? So I started with the Federal Trade Commission, and the reason I picked it, so we had these 50 sets of forms, and we said, where should we start? And I said, let's start with the Federal Trade Commission. One, because it's a relatively small agency. Two, at the time, it was in the middle of big investigations into Google, Facebook, Amazon, all the big tech companies, which are the most important right now. So we said, let's look at these forms, and let's say, what do we not want to see? We don't want these people to own Google, Facebook, Amazon. So we open up the forms, and then they own Google, Facebook, Amazon, and we're like, what's going on? The people running investigations into Facebook own stock in Facebook. And we're like, what a conflict of interest, like how can you do this? And then we said, okay, let's go to the EPA. What do you not want the EPA to own? You don't want them to own stock in car companies that produce emissions that the EPA is regulating, or you don't want them to own power plants that are emitting pollutants that the EPA is. And then sure enough, they all own that. And when I say they all, it wasn't they all. We took all this data, we put it into a spreadsheet, essentially, and we then use a different set of data, which is the lobbying disclosure data. And we took every company all companies that lobby those agencies. We did not want employees of those agencies to have an ownership in those companies. So any company that regulated, or any company that lobbied the agency, you shouldn't own stock in that company. And we found, I think, ultimately, 1 in 5 federal employees own stock in a company that their agency regulated. And so it's not, the majority, most people are doing okay, but 20% own stock, and it just seemed like an incredible conflict of interest to us. And then we did the human reporting. The reason I said it was not that hard is once we got the data's the data, you can't change the data. It's like, the stories are just there. We just had to write them. Person at the Defense Department owns stock at Lockheed Martin, so you're getting the data is the hard part. But then we called the people. So we called the guy at Lockheed. So there's a guy, called the guy at the Defense Department. There's a guy at the Defense Department who works in acquisitions, as in you're the one who gives out the government contracts, and the government contracts go to Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon, and this guy owns Lockheed. And we say, hey, sir, why do you own Lockheed Martin? And he says, well, it just seems like the government keeps giving them these big contracts. It seems like they're a good investment, which is true. But if you're the guy giving the contracts, you probably shouldn't own the stock. So anyway, we wrote 5 or 10 stories along those topics, and that ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize. And it was a lot of fun. But when I say it was not that hard, it's because once you get the data, my 10-year-old could have figured out how to write these stories.
I mean, definitely circling right around that. Another quote is, you reference journalism is not a science, but I try to treat it as much like a science as possible. And so again, in the stories that you're sort of talking about, how does that methodology sort of fit in? And when you're looking in, producing a story that's not just interesting or flashy, but really has an impact? Where does that come from?
Yeah, I think it's back to sort of coming up with a hypothesis and trying to find data to prove it or disprove it. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of data out there. There's some data that's hidden, but if you can find a good data set, you'll always find a good story and sort of layering human voices on top of it. When I say it's not a science, but I mean that you can talk to 20 people and reporters, like anyone else, have a limited amount of time. But a reporter sometimes has to produce a story once a day. I mean, in my world, I like to produce a story once every 3 months because it's a longer term investigative piece, and that gives me time. But my colleagues who are newer and right out of school, they need to produce a story once a day or once every few hours or seconds after a Donald Trump tweet or whatever he's doing. So you can't interview 1,000 people.
Yeah.
And I mean, ultimately you want to make sure you have the story right. On breaking news stories, you don't have the time to make sure it's right. And that leads to lots of mistakes because you can talk to 3 people and that's your analysis and you go with it and could be wrong. So I think in a world where there's no time constraints, there'd be more accuracy in journalism. But the name of the game is speed and getting news out quicker and faster, and there's just not the time, and therefore that leads to mistakes, errors, but also information that's not completely accurate all the time.
I know that circling back to, again, the root of a lot of your stories is the data and going back and really just sifting through tremendous amounts of information. But when we're looking at it, and I know that we've discussed that it's sort of lying in plain sight, these stories are always available. What are the resources and the different methodologies that we can, students here, individuals around the world, or even especially in the United States, can get?
Well, a lot of this information, like I said, because post-Watergate there's so much publicly available information. There's information that I can get as a reporter that you guys can get just as easily. And I may have more experience with looking at it, but a lot of this information is readily available. The lobby disclosure database, which we'll get to in a second, you can look up Google, who they're hiring, how much they're paying every quarter. It can be hard to synthesize that or compare to what is Google, where does Google rank among all big companies in terms of their lobbying expenditures. But there is a group called the Center for Responsive Politics, and they're called OpenSecrets.org, that pulls all that data together, and in 30 seconds you can get a list of the top spenders of last year or last quarter. You can see the biggest lobbying firms are. Off the top of my head, Paul Manafort, one of Donald Trump's closest advisors, has just started to become a lobbyist. You could go look right now and see who's Paul Manafort working for. Is he working for the Russian government? Is he working for some company in Ukraine? All this stuff is out there. As far as I know, that story has not been written, but like the information on what some people call like shady lobbyists, like this information is not shady, it's there. And you can just go find it. That's on the lobbying side. I think going back to the financial disclosure side, you can take your member of Congress and in a second go see what they're investing in. Not only what they're investing in, but every quarter, within 30 days of stock trade, they need to disclose what stock they bought, what stock they sold. There's this funny little thing, a little scary also. Some guy on Twitter has like a Nancy Pelosi stock fund, and he just invests in whatever Nancy Pelosi, and apparently he does really well. Which is a little crazy. But that shows that this is not hidden. This is out there. Now maybe you're 30 days behind Nancy Pelosi, but apparently that's still pretty good. On census data, there's reams of information, census data, where you can look by county or zip code or almost neighborhood, all sorts of demographic data on Americans, non-college educated, how much people make, what kind of schooling they have, like all sorts of stuff. And then you can take that data and overlay it with, well, did this district vote for Trump or for Biden or for Harris or whatever? And if you map that over time, you could see probably America moving from the sort of traditional Reagan conservative Republican Party to the Trump Party, moving from these states to these other states. All this data is out there. It's just a matter of figuring out how to. Well, one, I think my idea is, when I talk to people, like coming up with a hypothesis. Like you can't just look at data. Like let's come up with an idea. And once you have an idea, you're just using a scientific method. The data is there. Let's go look at it and see if your idea is true or not.
In your view, I know we've talked.
I'm sorry, just one final point here. I think the key here is that or journalists can spend their entire life in Washington, D.C. just talking to people and writing stories. And hopefully most of those stories are right. But a lot of them are wrong because you can't rely on humans and their opinions of what's going on to write accurate stories. But the data is always accurate. Right? You can always, like, that lobby exposure data, okay, we know it's off by a factor of 10 maybe, but at least on that 10%, like, among people who are registered, these are facts. Right. And you can then go get quotes about the facts, but like you start with facts. Otherwise, if you're just relying on humans, who knows? And I think that's another reason for the distrust in the media. That, you know, Fox News says this, and CNBC or CNN says that, because they're talking to two separate sets of people.
Yeah, I think that we've talked a lot about really the role that research plays, and as we're coming up to the end of the time before we open up to questions, I wanted to just talk to you about what do you think, you know, your role is. You've been in this role a long time as an investigative journalist. What do you think the role is for democracy as a whole, and then for individuals who may not consider themselves investigative journalists, who may sit here and say, oh, I'm a pre-med, or I'm a humanities major, or I'm a social sciences major. How can they incorporate the techniques that you spent your life doing into their own fields to sort of benefit them?
Well, let's see. I think there's a positive answer and a negative answer here. You know, on the negative side, the journalism industry, you know, we are a business, is not a very good business right now because of the internet. I mean, when I started the Wall Street Journal, journal cost like $500 a year, let's say, and we had advertisements. And if you wanted news, you had to turn on the broadcast channels, the 3 or 4 of them, and a couple of cables, or buy one of 20 newspapers around the country. Now, you know, you can get you're getting your news from everywhere, and that information doesn't need to be accurate. The information you read, who knows where it's coming from? It's faster than the journal, so people are willing to pay for the journal. We like to say that we're right, but a lot of times people don't care that they have. You know, you can get it from Twitter or from Facebook or blah, blah, you know. So that means that newspapers have media firms, cable firms, have less money to invest in good, hardcore investigative journalism. You know, I told you when I'm at the journal where I'm writing something, I'm trying to write a story that takes 3 months, that is right, but is big and broad and is important, and hopefully hold some powerful institutions or members of Congress accountable for some wrongdoing. But I have 20-year-old colleagues who are writing 500 stories at that time, and they're cheaper and faster.
Right.
And the business model gives more of incentive to hire that type of journalist and less to invest in longer term. So therefore, there's fewer investigative journalists. So what is the problem with that? It means that members of Congress can get away with whatever they want. And particularly time right now when the government oversight is being whacked, to sort of lose the government oversight and the journalism oversight at the same time is troubling for democracy.
Right.
On the flip side, the fact that anyone can be a citizen journalist at any point should be a positive.
Right.
You know, it should be before, like when I started journalism, if you want to be an investigative reporter, you had to work at the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. You can do it right now. I mean, all that information, all those resources I just gave you, you would literally look at a lunch break and find, oh, why is Facebook giving so much money to my member of Congress? And oh, my member of Congress voted for all these things. That you could put a blog post out there right now that would be helpful in sharing information to other people. So there's no barriers to entry in journalism anymore, which for young people is great. You don't need to work your way up to get to the Wall Street Journal. You can start your own publication. You can start your own blog. You can start your own Substack or whatever you want to put information out there that is publicly available very easily and put out in your own form and own voice.
And then going back to, again, just before we wrap up, so for individuals who may not think about themselves as journalists in these other fields, you know, those same principles of the two sort of parts of the story, how does that sort of play into that?
In terms of someone doing it on their own?
Yeah.
So I'm saying these 2 parts, data plus human. To me, that's just a way of writing a great story. But you don't have to have it that way. I mean, I think if someone were to write stories for a long time just without data, I mean, you know, when I was first a reporter, well, you don't have the perfect mix.
Right.
But you know, in the beginning, you want to rely on facts, and after writing the same factual story over and over again, you think, well, how can I make this more interesting or better? And it's like, well, let's get some people involved, or let's find a person with a different way to tell the story. So I think it's something you sort of aspire to, but it doesn't have to happen right away. Yeah.
And you would say that balance is sort of different depending on the story as well.
who never talk to people. They're only into data. And then I have colleagues who are only, I mean, if you cover the White House, you're just at the White House all day, you're never looking at data.
Right.
You're just being talked to and you're writing stories.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that if you combine both of those, you can have the better, more impactful, or certainly more interesting stories.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the time before we open up for questions. Everyone, please give a great round of applause for Brody Mullins. Again, thank you. And I think we're just going to have you guys just raise hands. Yep, in the back.
I have a question. Like,
Yeah.
according to your, let's say, analysis, has there been like an increase in, let's say, lobbyists with a correlation to like insider trading?
That's a really good question.
Could you
That-
repeat the question?
Yeah,
And would you mind standing up for us? Thank you.
Not bad. So my name is Marvin. So my question is like, has there been a correlation between the increased number of lobbyists and then like insider trading as of now?
I don't know the answer because that's an area where there actually isn't a lot of data. I tried to write about this topic about 10 years ago because insider information is a legal term. It's you probably give us a better definition of insider trading. It's non-public market-moving information from the top levels of a company that's leaked out so that people acquire and then trade on. Information in Wall Street and Washington are completely different places. The SEC has insider trading rules in Wall Street that says people who have insider information can't share it, and if they do share it, those people can't trade on it. And so information is going to be protected and locked down until it is announced every quarter or in every financial report. And that reports are broadly disseminated so anyone can trade out at the same time. So you have just as much of a shot as Goldman Sachs of trading on information. Washington is different. Washington is about promoting the First Amendment and disclosure and information and talking. So members of Congress and everything in Washington is based on talking, on getting your argument out there. And therefore, we don't have rules limiting information. However, lobbyists work for, let's say, General Motors, just to make something up. The lobbyist for General Motors knows, the lobbyist for General Motors goes and talks to his company, and the company says, hey, if we get 25% tariff, we're gonna go bankrupt. Like, people don't know how bad things are here. Go tell Congress not to impose a 25% tariff. The lobbyist all of a sudden knows, holy crap, these tariffs are way worse than General Motors, so like, they could trade on that information. Also, the member of Congress goes, or the lobbyist goes to Congress and says, hey, I'm working for General Motors. You put them out of business if you do this 25% tariff. Now the member of Congress and their staff knows how bad of a shape General Motors is, so they could trade on that. Then you have the member of Congress who could have a committee hearing on it, or could give a speech on it, or could, so people are sort of, in Washington, we talk about information, put it out there, and we don't have rules for keeping it non-public, and therefore there's tremendous opportunity for people to trade on inside information. Also, let's say the member of Congress comes up with a bill and there's a vote on the bill to exempt GM from the tariff. There's 100 senators. There are people counting the votes who know whether that bill's gonna pass or not. Whether that bill passes or not is whether GM goes out of business or not. This is obviously an extreme example, but there are so many factors in Congress that affect the stock price just the way a bad quarterly result is. But in Washington, there's no rules. It's all we're allowed to talk about it. So there's definitely all sorts of potential for wrongdoing. The problem is, and I'm not, as a reporter, I'm not gonna say the problem is, but the problem is the First Amendment. So the First Amendment says we're allowed to talk. We can't hide things. We want everything out there. We don't want restrictions on information in Washington. So those two factors sort of create a problem that could lead to a lot of insider trading. And that's why people think, and I don't think it's true, that Nancy Pelosi is straight on insider information.
I saw these two hands first, so I'll move right first, and then.
Hi, I'm Caroline, chemical engineering major for MIT. I think a lot of universities are concerned right now about obviously the potential drops in science funding that are happening. So I guess I'm kind of curious about how universities or other nonprofit organizations can lobby or advocate for policies that benefit them, and if there's any extra restrictions or regulations surrounding that.
Yeah, so there's no restrictions or regulations surrounding lobbying. Universities professors, anyone is allowed to talk to their member of Congress. The problem in Washington right now is that Donald Trump is making all policy himself, without going to Congress. The way things normally work, and we could revert to a normal period, we'll see. Trump is saying, cut this, cut this, cut this, cut this. Under the Constitution, Congress has the power to fund things or not fund things. So ultimately, it should be up to Congress to decide whether the grants and funding go to universities, and therefore, the members of Congress who represent, Boston or, any other university, they should have the influence. So the answer in a normal world is to go to your local members of Congress and have them stand up for funding that helps their constituents in their universities. The question is whether Congress is going to stand up to Trump. So far, they haven't. I think under the Constitution, they have to. But so far it hasn't happened, so we'll see. I mean, I think ultimately, if any funding is going to get cut, whether it's for renewable vehicles or for USAID or for universities, almost all of it has to go through Congress. And it's not a great answer, but everything that Trump is doing, because it's not going through Congress, is short term. Once he's not president, the next president can snap all this up back in place. Now, is there harm in the meantime? Of course. Will everything go back to normal? No. But a lot of these funding cuts, hopefully, will be temporary.
Let me amplify before the next question, on your very good question about lobbyists from universities. Just in the last few weeks, there's been a tremendous increase in lobbyists from universities to Washington, as you can probably imagine. And they are not lobbying so much the Congress, they're lobbying the advisors to Trump right now, because that's where the lobbying's going on. As you said correctly, Congress has been very, let's just say, hands-off on what Trump is doing up to now. But there are some exceptions to that, hopefully increasing now. But the point is that the amount of lobbies coming from universities and the money spent by universities has grown exponentially in the last few weeks.
It's a great question. All right, we have to come back to this side. Crystal.
Hi, my name is Crystal. So my question is, I know you said that all this information.
Could you stand up and talk a
Yeah.
little louder?
Hi, Crystal. But I know you said that all that information, as far as like money and like the financial reports, is like open to the public. But with like the new administration, like you said, between like the lack of like government oversight and the new like flood the zone strategy, is there ways that has affected like your work or ways in which you anticipate it to affect how you report or like how you go through your methodology?
I think there's two answers. I'm a longer-term investigative reporter, so right now I'm working on a book. So a book comes out in like 2 years, so I've got plenty of time to wait for things to come out. The problem with right now is the speed at which things are happening, the flood the zone strategy, that people don't have the time because it's boom, 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 like story after story after story after story. And Trump is really good at flooding the zone with stories and information that he wants out there. So I think in terms of accountability right now, yes, it's a huge problem because no one has it. There is no bandwidth to like look behind the corner and see what's gonna happen next because people are just drinking from a fire hose at this point.
But there is, and this is one question I could ask you as well, the impact of artificial intelligence on what you do or what other people can do who are not, quote, investigative reporters, but some idea about tariffs comes out, or in your case, trading by FTC employees.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even though you said there's a lot of data there, the amount of time it took you to go through that 5 years
Right.
ago and now is probably quite different.
Right. Yeah, and going on that point, a theory of journalism that I have is if there's an area where there's publicly disclosed data, the longer it goes between people actually looking at that data, the longer time that no one's looking at that, the more likely there is for corruption. So in this case, these financial disclosure forms, like members of the executive branch have been required since 1978 to fill out these financial disclosure forms. And the first year, everyone's probably really careful. And the next year, they're careful. And after 10 years, you're like, hey, no one's one of these forms. Right. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, I come along. And they're like, oh, crap. you know, like it would have gotten away from it. So now they'll like snap back, but no one's gonna look at those forms again for a long time. But AI could. You could set up something that's scraping them all the time, and so I'm going along doing my job, and AI comes to me and says, holy crap, I found insider trading at DPA, you should go look at this. So instead of me having to constantly look at that, you could have a system to sort of backstop you there.
Great, thank you. Another question?
So, you know,
Please stand up.
oh,
And
okay.
it's all those-
Hi, my name's Farhan Danish. I'm from Rutgers University.
Cool.
A lot of journalists and political science have started coining the age that we live in now as the new Gilded Age, where as compared to the old Gilded Age, corporations and their immense wealth is inextricably tied to political power in a way that we've never seen before. So, you know, in ways that we've had this entrenched power before, one of the main ways that, you know, the public has been able to counter it is by mass social movements that have been catalyzed by journalists such as yourself. So, you know, it's almost a two-part question, but, you know, in your line of work now, currently, where do you see the role of journalists in helping to uproot that entrenched power, and how do you see the current administration's kind of attack on the media and the proliferation of the term fake news as inhibiting that process?
So I think, you know, as I mentioned, the journalism industry is in a really bad position right now, with lack of resources, with AI, with you know, with the internet, you know, which is not new, and now with Trump, you know, attacking the media and sort of the fact that he sort of split the media. We have this partisan media on both sides and very few in the middle. All of that's a problem. On the broader Gilded Age point, though, I actually do see some signs of hope, which is hard to see with Trump. But for 50 years, we've been in this new Gilded Age, or 4 years maybe, where big, powerful companies have you know, had promoted income inequality or resulted in income inequality. They've had the political power, they own the politicians, and they've gotten whatever they want. I mean, big companies want free trade, immigration, lower taxes, and less regulation. And from the 1980s to like 5 years ago, that's what they got. Now things are changing. This is my next book, so don't steal it. Increasing number of populist Republicans, like J.D. Vance and maybe Donald Trump and Josh Hawley, who's a Republican from Missouri, and some others, are anti-corporate, who think that these big companies have gotten too much of what they want, and now want to give regular Americans more, a better seat at the table. Meantime, on the left, you have Elizabeth Warren and AOC and Lena Khan, if you know her, former FTC chair. They are saying the same thing. And these two sides are starting to meet in the middle. So Josh Hawley is the Republican senator from Missouri who on January 6th, you know, was this guy. Everyone knows him for that. In the last 2 years, he's come out with 3 or 4 bills with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on issues you would never believe. One is capping credit card interest rates with Bernie Sanders. They also have a bill that would cap bonuses for big banks. They have a bill that makes it easier for people to join labor unions. So these are all things that Elizabeth Warren's been fighting for her whole life. But Josh Hawley, what is he doing on these things? And it's because he's in Missouri, and there's no companies in Missouri, and all his constituents are poor. And so he's like, why am I helping these big companies? They're not helping me. And so you're having this sort of realignment of both parties. I don't know how far this will go. It's hard for me to see the parties inverting and the Republican Party becoming the party of the poor and the Democratic Party being the party of companies. But that's what Donald Trump just did. I mean, he won with all these non-college educated, no one on the East Coast, you know, rural folks. So there's a coalition there. Is there a third party? Well, I can't see that happening. But if you look at history, it happens all the time. Not all the time, but like, you know, we're not gonna have the Republican Democratic Party forever. Like, things are gonna change. So are we at that inflection point? So Trump makes all this noise, so it's hard to see beyond there. But the people who Trump is putting into power in his administration in business regulatory positions, as in the chairman of the FTC who replaced Lena Khan, and the chair and the head of the antitrust division at DOJ, there's the 2 main antitrust regulators, are very similar to Lena Khan. They agree that tech should be broken up. They want to go after healthcare. They think there's over consolidation in the food industry, in the ag industry, and eggs and poultry, blah, 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 blah. Like, you would think that they are Democrats. In fact, I was speaking, because I'm working this book, to the head of the antitrust division at DOJ who's the person in charge of blocking court, or approving or blocking court mergers, and she talks about globalism. The word globalism is a bad word, and that's, Republicans, the whole country has been built on globalism, and now they're saying it's bad because it's hurting workers, which is a crazy thing to hear. The head of the FTC, a Republican, the other day was giving a talk on Wall Street and said, we're not the Bush administration. Like looking down on the Bush administration. Like they're both Republicans, But like this shows how things are changing right now. So I think there is sort of a silver lining that the era where big companies had all this power is waning. Now the flip side is Elon Musk and crypto. That's a whole other. That's for the next hour discussion.
Great question. Let's get right here.
So speaking about big companies, also my name's a company, but speaking about big companies, I know that Google, Facebook, like in 2016, they had like their own fine-tuned algorithms that create like a bubble. I watched this documentary called The Social Dilemma. So when you're sourcing human intelligence, and now it's more so Twitter-based, or just honestly talking to people, how do you filter through that idea that a bubble is formed with when people are like voicing their intelligence?
So luckily for me, I don't trust tech. So when reporters quote someone puts that on Twitter, no, that's another one. You can go if it's like an important person. No, Senator Josh Hawley said on Twitter. That's different. But yeah, you're too open to having people send you the information that they want you to quote. So I don't buy that. I think it's talking to regular people. But there even needs to be a filtering of regular voices. Like if I go out right now and walk down the street here and talk to 10 people in New Haven and say like, oh, American state, blah, blah, blah. No, people in New Haven think this. Right. Like New Haven is not America. New Haven is New Haven. And one of the reasons that people think reporters have a bias, and I agree reporters have a bias, is because we're kind of all from New Haven. Every reporter grew up in the East Coast or West Coast, went to an elite school, lots of Ivy Leagues, we all have jobs, we haven't touched guns, we don't smoke cigarettes, like we're like, we don't go to church, like we're in this part, and the rest of the country is different. And that's fine, but we can't act like this is all America. And that's why Trump people and Republicans hate the media, because they're like, you don't represent us, and that's because we don't. We're only talking to our bubble. So my point is that the internet may have this bubble, but so do we. Like for example, in Washington D.C., I don't know if you guys had it where you guys live, but during the Harris Trump campaign, there was signs in our neighborhood street signs or yard signs that would say Harris, no duh, or something like that. Like how could there possibly be another choice? And that just kind of shows how elitist we are, Because like everyone outside the country, everyone in the regular part of the country, like of course there's a question here, But for us, it was like, how can you possibly think of someone else? And it's like very snooty, but it kind of shows like the bubble that I live in, the bubble that other people live in.
Great question. One more from this side. I saw your hand. I'll say it back to you.
Hi, my name is Emma, and I'm studying biomedical engineering at Columbia. And I lead a program for students interested in public health and how they can use data to answer important questions and ultimately make donations. So I'd love to hear from you, what are some strategies you use in journalism to make data feel relevant and accessible?
Yeah, I think it's the same idea. Is like if data gets you to the truth, or as close to the truth as possible, and no offense, but sometimes the truth is boring. So like, what's the story? What's the person? What story can you put a face or a personality that helps tell that story, or brings the data to life? And that's something I think that's a little different between scientific or medical research and journalism research. Is that we're looking for a way to take that data point to life by finding a person or a narrative to put on top of it.
Great. I think that brings us to the end of our time. Mr. Mullins will be here after our talks during our little lunch between these talks and the poster session. So if any questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to speak with you. And again, please give a big round of applause. I know we're going to recruit you Professor Altman as a little panel session during that conversation. So we'd like to welcome down Richard to welcome Professor Altman for his